She was kneeling beside her father's casket when the first slap came. Her stepmother's hand connected with her cheek so hard that mourners gasped, all because she'd helped a paralyzed beggar in a wheelchair into the funeral home. What no one knew, not even her, was that the beggar was actually her father's lawyer in disguise, testing who truly deserved the inheritance. And when he stood up from that wheelchair at the will reading and announced she'd just inherited a $500 billion empire, her stepmother's face went white. The woman who just publicly humiliated her for showing kindness was about to lose everything, and she had no idea what was coming. The sound of the slap lingered longer than the pain. It echoed through the vaulted ceiling of the funeral home, bounced once against the stained glass windows, and settled into the silence that followed. People froze. A cough halfway formed, never finished. Someone near the back whispered a name, hers, but it came out like a question. Rowan Hale did not fall. She didn't stagger or raise a hand to her face. She remained kneeling, one palm resting against the polished oak of her father's casket, the other still holding the folded program that listed his name in formal type, as if distance and formatting could make death orderly. Across from her, Maribel Hale stood rigid, fingers trembling from the force of what she'd done. Her expression wasn't rage, not exactly. It was fear dressed as authority, the reflex of someone who had learned long ago that control was easiest when exercised publicly. "You embarrassed this family," Maribel said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the murmurs. "On this day of all days." Rowan slowly turned her head. Her cheek burned, but her eyes were steady. If she felt humiliation, it didn't surface. Years of quiet endurance had taught her that visible emotion only invited escalation. Behind them, the man in the wheelchair waited. He was positioned, just inside the doorway, rainwater still clinging to the wheels. His coat was threadbare, his shoes mismatched, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He hadn't spoken when Rowan had opened the door for him 10 minutes earlier, only lifted his eyes in something like apology, as if existing in that space was already an imposition. Rowan had noticed what others didn't, the way the funeral attendant hesitated, the way Maribel's gaze slid past the man as though he were furniture, the way people who had known her father for decades suddenly became very busy not seeing. "It's okay," Rowan had said then, soft but clear. "There's room." She had pushed the door wider herself. That moment, small, almost forgettable, now hovered over the room like a held breath. Maribel turned to the crowd, already recalibrating. "My stepdaughter is emotional," she said, placing a hand over her own chest. "Grief makes people act out." Rowan rose to her feet at last. And quickly, not slowly. With the same measured pace she'd used her entire life, especially after her father remarried, and the house learned new rules that were never written down. She looked at the casket again. Silas Hale, industrialist, philanthropist, a man whose name funded hospitals and swallowed competitors whole. To the world, he'd been precise and unsentimental. To Rowan, he'd been distant, but observant, someone who spoke rarely, but watched constantly. Her cheek still burned. She welcomed it. Pain anchored her to the present, kept memory from pulling her under. A flash surfaced anyway. She was 16, standing in her father's study, holding a letter she wasn't supposed to see. Maribel's voice behind her, smooth and instructive. "You have to understand, Rowan. This isn't personal. It's practical." That word, practical, had followed her ever since. Practical rooms she wasn't invited into. Practical decisions made without her. Practical silences. Now, the same woman stood in black silk, having struck her in front of everyone who mattered. Rowan met Maribel's eyes. There was no challenge in her expression. No plea. Just recognition. "I'm sorry," Rowan said quietly. Not for what she'd done, but for something else entirely. Maribel flinched, just slightly. She turned away first. The service continued, though it never fully recovered its rhythm. Words were spoken, prayers recited. People stole glances at Rowan's face, already flushing beneath pale skin. No one approached her. Sympathy, like kindness, had limits. Only the man in the wheelchair watched her without looking away. When the service ended, phones came out. Messages were typed. A few discreet photos circulated, already shedding context as they moved from contact to contact. The slap would travel faster than the truth ever could. Rowan stepped aside as the crowd thinned. She stood alone near the exit, listening to the rain begin again outside. Somewhere behind her, the wheelchair shifted. "Miss Hale," a voice said gently. She turned. The man looked up at her, eyes sharp now, assessing. Not grateful, not apologetic, intentional. "Thank you," he said, "for earlier." Rowan nodded once. Of course. She didn't know why his gaze lingered, or why something in her chest tightened, not with fear, but with the faintest sense of being seen. None of them knew yet that systems were already in motion, that files had been opened long before this day. That kindness, once observed, could not be unseen. The room emptied, the rain fell harder, and the test had already been passed. The will is a mechanism, not a moment. The will reading was scheduled for 48 hours later, not out of ceremony but necessity. Silas Hale had hated delays. He believed time softened accountability, turned precision into sentiment. The notice arrived by email, identical wording sent to each beneficiary, board observer, and legal representative. No condolences, no explanation, just a location, a time, and a reminder that attendance was mandatory for claim validation. Rowan read it once on her phone, then deleted it. She did not need the reminder. She would have gone even if it hadn't been required, the same way she'd shown up to every quiet obligation in her life without being asked. The law office occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower downtown, the kind of building designed to look neutral while controlling everything inside it. On the morning of the reading, the city was unusually clear. No fog, no rain. The skyline looked sharpened, as if edges had been redrawn overnight. Maribel arrived early. She always did. Control began with proximity, being seen first, choosing the seat, setting the temperature of the room before anyone else could complain. She wore slate gray this time instead of black, a deliberate shift. Mourning had served its purpose. Now came positioning. Her attorney, Calvin Rourke, leaned close and murmured reassurances she barely heard. Her attention was fixed on the long table, the leather chairs, the sealed folders placed at each seat. Rowan's name was printed on one of them, identical font, identical weight. That irritated her more than she expected. Rowan entered without announcement. No escort, no pause at the door. She wore the same coat she'd worn to the funeral, though she'd cleaned the blood from the cuff where her nails had bitten into her palm afterward. Her cheek had faded from red to yellow, a detail she hadn't bothered to cover. A few heads turned. No one spoke. She took her seat and folded her hands in front of her, posture straight, but unguarded. She looked neither at Maribel nor at the attorneys. Her gaze rested instead on the far wall, where a framed mission statement hung in brushed steel letters. Integrity is not declared. It is observed. Her father's words. The door closed. The man from the funeral entered last. He did not use the wheelchair this time. The absence of it was the loudest thing in the room. He walked without assistance, his posture upright, his stride unremarkable, intentionally so. He wore a tailored suit now, charcoal with a conservative tie, and carried a slim briefcase that looked too light to matter and somehow heavier than anything else present. A quiet ripple moved through the room. Someone inhaled sharply. Someone else whispered, "That's..." The man set the briefcase down, and took his place at the head of the table. "My name is Alden Cross," he said, voice level, unhurried. "Senior executor of the Silas Hale estate." No emphasis, no reveal, just a fact, delivered as though it had always been obvious. Maribel's face tightened, then smoothed. "I don't understand," she said carefully. "You were testing," Cross replied. "A process your husband authorized 14 months ago." He opened the briefcase. Inside were folders, identical to the ones already on the table. Systems nested within systems. Mr. Hale believed character was most clearly revealed when no reward was visible, Cross continued, particularly in moments where kindness carried social cost. Rowan did not move. Cross glanced at her once, brief and neutral, then returned to the group. "The will is structured in phases," he said. "We will proceed sequentially." He pressed a button on the tablet in front of him. Phones vibrated around the table, a chorus of soft alerts. Emails arriving simultaneously, subject lines stark and procedural. Account status update. Board authorization notice. Asset reclassification. Maribel's attorney frowned at his screen. "This must be an error," he said, scrolling quickly. Cross did not respond immediately. He waited until the room had fully noticed the change. "The Hale Global Trust," he said, "has been activated." Another vibration, this time louder. A woman at the far end of the table, a board liaison Rowan barely recognized, stood abruptly. "My access." "Yes," Cross said. "Access has been reassigned." Maribel's phone rang. She ignored it. Then it rang again. Considered. That was new. "What is this?" she asked, the edge in her voice barely contained. Cross finally looked at her directly. "This," he said, "is the execution of instructions left by your husband while he was still capable of disappointment." He slid a document across the table, not toward Maribel, toward Rowan. Rowan reached for it without hesitation. The first line was not a number, not a valuation. It was a sentence, handwritten and scanned into the official record. If you are reading this, then someone chose decency when it cost them something. Her fingers tightened once, then relaxed. Around her, the room began to fracture. Calvin Rourke's phone buzzed again. He paled. "Maribel," he said under his breath. "Your accounts. They're frozen. Personal and discretionary. Corporate privileges revoked pending." "Pending what?" she snapped. "Pending review," Cross said, "which has already begun." Rowan sat still. She did not smile. She did not look surprised. She listened. The power shift did not explode. It unfolded, quietly, irrevocably, through notifications, authorizations, denials, a system correcting itself after years of tolerated error. And for the first time since the funeral, Rowan understood something with perfect clarity. This was not a gift. It was a responsibility already in motion. The meeting adjourned without ceremony. There was no dramatic exit, no raised voices, no demand for order. Alden Cross closed his folder, stood, and left the room exactly as he had entered it, without urgency. The door shut behind him with a soft hydraulic seal, the sound more final than a slammed gavel. No one followed. Maribel remained seated for a full 10 seconds after everyone else began moving. 10 seconds was a long time for someone who had never been last. Her phone lay face down in front of her, vibrating intermittently, each pulse shorter than the last, as if the device itself were losing patience. Rowan rose when it was appropriate to do so, when chairs scraped, when the illusion of normal procedure attempted to reassert itself. She gathered the single document Cross had slid toward her and placed it into her bag with care, as if it were fragile. She did not look at Maribel. That omission landed harder than any accusation. "Rowan," Maribel's voice cracked on, the name. She stood now, unsteady, heels clicking once as she turned. "You knew." It wasn't a question. It was an attempt at narrative repair. Rowan paused. She did not turn fully around, only enough to acknowledge the sound. "I knew my father," she said. "Nothing more." Maribel laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound that drew attention from the attorneys, still pretending not to watch. "Don't do that," she said. "Don't pretend this wasn't planned." Rowan met her eyes then. Her expression was unreadable, not cold, not kind, observant. "Planning implies intent," Rowan said. "Observation does not." She left. Outside, the city moved on schedule. Traffic lights cycled. A delivery truck blocked the crosswalk and earned a horn blast from somewhere unseen. Rowan stood on the sidewalk for a moment, disoriented by the normality of it all. Power had shifted. Empires had changed hands. And yet the world refused to pause in recognition. Her phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen. Hale Global Trust. Executive access granted. Board session scheduled. 24 hours. Security protocol update. Primary identity confirmed. She turned the phone face down. That night, Rowan sat alone in her apartment, the same one she'd lived in since graduate school. It was modest, sparsely furnished, deliberately unremarkable. She had never moved into her father's properties. Distance had been a kind of control she could maintain. Now, distance was evaporating. Emails arrived in waves, carefully worded, professionally deferential. People who had never answered her messages before suddenly discovered her inbox. She did not respond to any of them. Instead, she opened the secure portal Cross had activated and began reading. There were layers she had not anticipated. Shell companies nested within charitable foundations, deferred authority clauses, silent partners whose names appeared only in footnotes. And beneath it all, a pattern, not of generosity, but of surveillance. Her father had been watching for a long time. Rowan closed the laptop shortly after midnight. She dreamed of the funeral, not the slap, but the moment before it. The second when she'd reached for the door handle and felt the weight of choice settle into her hand. In the dream, she hesitated. In the dream, she let go. She woke with her heart racing. The next morning, Maribel's world continued to narrow. Her personal driver did not arrive. Her credit cards declined without explanation. The doorman at the residential tower hesitated before letting her pass, eyes flicking to a screen Maribel could not see. When she called Calvin Rourke, his assistant answered and asked to schedule a call for next week. By noon, the press had the outline of the story, though not the details. Hale estate executes surprise succession plan. Widow loses control amid governance shift. Speculation bloomed where facts were thin. Maribel sat alone in the house she had redecorated 3 times and no longer owned. At 3 in the afternoon, her phone rang. She answered on the second ring. "I want to talk," she said, before the other person could speak. There was a pause. Then Rowan's voice, calm, distant. "About what?" "You destroyed me," Maribel said. The words came out flat, exhausted. "And you did it quietly. That's worse." Rowan closed her eyes, not in pain, but in acknowledgement. "You were never destroyed," she said. "You were corrected." Silence stretched. "You let him test me," Maribel said at last. "You stood there and let him humiliate me." Rowan leaned back against the kitchen counter. The marble was cool through her sleeve. "I didn't know who he was," she said. "Neither did you." "That's a lie," Maribel said. "You always knew you were different." Rowan considered that. Different was not the word she would have chosen. "Different isn't the same as prepared," she said. Another pause. This one heavier. "Did you want this?" Maribel asked. Not accusatory now. Curious. Afraid. Rowan did not answer immediately. Outside, a siren passed and faded. Somewhere, a notification chimed. "I don't know yet," Rowan said finally. The call ended without resolution. Rowan stood alone in her kitchen long after, phone still in her hand, confronted with an unfamiliar truth. power had answered questions she hadn't asked, and in doing so, it had created new ones she could not ignore. The boardroom was colder than Rowan expected, not in temperature, though the air conditioning hummed with clinical efficiency, but in design. Everything was glass, steel, and distance. The table alone could have seated 40, though only 12 chairs were occupied. Each person sat equidistant from the next, a geometry of restraint. Rowan took the central seat without comment. No one objected. Authority, once recognized by systems, required no performance. Alden Cross stood to her right, tablet in hand. He did not introduce her. He didn't need to. The first agenda item wasn't profit. It was compliance. Over the last decade, Cross said, several discretionary accounts were used in ways that exceeded their stated purpose. He did not look at Rowan when he said this. He looked at the board. Screens activated around the room. Charts appeared. Timelines. Transactions stripped of narrative and presented as sequence. Rowan watched silently. This was the part no one talked about. The moment where inheritance stopped being symbolic and became forensic. Each line item represented a choice someone had made believing it would never be seen again. A board member cleared his throat. These initiatives were approved under Rowan Hale's authority, he said carefully. At the time, they were within tolerance. Tolerance is not ethics, Cross replied. Rowan shifted slightly in her chair. The movement drew attention despite its subtlety. Pause, she said. The screens froze. All eyes turned to her. She waited until the room stilled, not because she demanded it, but because silence had learned to gather around her. How many people lost jobs when these funds were diverted? She asked. Cross glanced at his tablet. Approximately 800 across subsidiary operations. Indirectly, more. Rowan nodded once. Restore them. There was hesitation, not resistance, confusion. That would require unwinding several active restructurings, someone said. It will trigger, I know, Rowan said. Proceed anyway. No anger, no justification, just instruction. Emails began sending before the sentence fully settled. Systems adjusting. Budgets rerouting. A reversal unfolding not as apology, but as correction. The board moved on, unsettled. After the meeting, Cross walked with Rowan through the corridor that overlooked the city. From this height, people were abstract, movement without identity. You could have left those structures intact, he said. No one would have challenged you. Rowan stopped walking. She rested her hands lightly on the railing. That's the problem, she said. No one was challenging anything. Cross studied her profile. Your father believed pressure revealed truth. Yes, Rowan replied. And pressure also breaks things that were never meant to carry it. He said nothing to that. 3 weeks later, Rowan stood in the restored manufacturing facility outside Dayton, Ohio. The parking lot was full again. Lunch trucks lined the curb. Inside, machines whirred, not efficiently, but earnestly. A man approached her, wiping his hands on his jacket. They told us you reversed it, he said. That we're back. Rowan nodded. You're back. He hesitated. Why? The question landed heavier than accusation. Rowan considered several answers. None felt complete. Because it was wrong, she said finally. He smiled, not gratefully, but with something like relief. That's rare, he said. Someone saying that without a speech attached. That night, Rowan sat alone in one of her father's houses for the first time. It was larger than she preferred, quiet in a way that felt intentional. She wandered through rooms filled with objects chosen for longevity rather than comfort. In the study, she found a locked drawer she had never seen opened. Inside was a single notebook. Her name was written on the first page in her father's precise hand. She read until dawn. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't an apology. It was a record. Observations, doubts, contingency plans. Pages detailing people he trusted, then crossed out. Pages questioning whether wealth could ever be stewarded without distortion. One passage stopped her. If you are reading this after I am gone, then you have already been judged by circumstances I designed. I hope I was wrong to believe this was necessary. I fear I was not. Rowan closed the notebook. For the first time since the will reading, her composure fractured, not outwardly, but internally. A pressure behind her eyes she refused to name. The next morning, Maribel arrived unannounced. She looked smaller, not weaker, just reduced, as if the world had stopped accommodating her angles. "You planned this," Maribel said once they were seated across from each other. No pleasantries, no masks left to wear. Rowan did not deny it. "My father did," she said. "I participated by being myself." "That's a convenient story," Maribel said. "You benefited either way." "Yes," Rowan replied. "That's what makes it difficult." Maribel laughed softly. "You don't get to feel guilty and righteous at the same time." Rowan met her gaze. "Why not?" Silence filled the room, not hostile, but unresolved. Maribel stood. "You won," she said, "but don't pretend you didn't want to." After she left, Rowan remained seated long after the door closed. The systems had worked. The injustices were being corrected. The empire was stable. And yet, for the first time, Rowan wondered whether precision without mercy was simply another form of inheritance she hadn't chosen, but now carried. 18 months later, the empire no longer made noise. That was its greatest success. The Hale Global Trust posted consistent growth. Labor disputes dropped. Regulatory audits passed without comment. Rowan Hale appeared in headlines only when required, usually accompanied by words like stabilizing, corrective, or unemotional. She was not photographed smiling. She was not invited onto panels about leadership. Markets trusted her. People were less certain. Rowan watched the quarterly briefing from her office. Not the main one, but a smaller annex she preferred. The screen displayed figures that would have once felt abstract. Now they carried weight, because she understood what had been dismantled to achieve them. Alden Cross stood at the front of the room, older now, or perhaps simply less concealed by authority. "The transition period is considered complete," he said. "By all measurable standards, the estate is healthy." Applause followed. Polite, professional. Rowan did not join it. Afterward, Cross met her in the corridor. "You've succeeded where others would have failed," he said. "That's not flattery. It's accounting." She nodded. "Accounting always balances eventually." He studied her. "And personally?" Rowan considered the question longer than she should have. "I sleep," she said. "Just not deeply." A month later, she received a letter. It was handwritten. That alone made it disruptive. The sender was a former regional director, someone whose department had been dissolved during the initial freezes. Not corrupt, not innocent. Useful. "You were right to correct the system," the letter read. "But you should know my son no longer believes institutions care about fairness. He believes they care about efficiency. I don't know if you taught him that, or if the world did. I only know he learned it when we lost everything." Rowan folded the letter and placed it in the same drawer as her father's notebook. That night, she stood, alone outside the old funeral home. The building had not changed. Same stone steps, same glass doors. She had asked no one for permission to be there. No systems were notified of her presence. Inside, the space was quiet, stripped of ceremony. She stood where she had knelt 18 months earlier and tried to recall the exact weight of that moment, the ignorance, the simplicity of choice. She could not. Memory had been edited by consequence. Her phone vibrated once. Ethics Committee. Review closed. No action required. She turned the phone off. Later that week, she met Maribel one final time, not by appointment, But coincidence? A charity gala Rowan had declined, a side entrance, an unplanned overlap of lives that had once been inseparable. Maribel looked, adjusted, not recovered, not defeated. "You built something impressive," Maribel said, watching servers move between tables. "It just doesn't love you back." Rowan considered that. "Did it ever love you?" Maribel smiled faintly. "No, but I thought it needed me." They stood in silence. "You know," Maribel said at last, "if you'd stopped him, if you'd refused the test, you'd still be who you were that day." Rowan met her eyes. "And how would I know that?" Maribel shrugged. "You wouldn't. That's the cost, isn't it?" They parted without forgiveness. Months passed. Rowan began funding something new, not through the trust, not under her name. A legal defense network for people harmed by restructuring they never influenced. It operated quietly, inefficiently, humanly. Cross warned her it would never scale. "That's the point," Rowan replied. On the anniversary of her father's death, Rowan returned to her apartment, the old one. She sat at the same table where she had once ignored emails that would have changed her life. She opened the notebook again. On the last page, in a hand less certain than the rest, her father had written, "Power clarifies who we are. It does not ask permission first." Rowan closed the book. Outside, the city moved forward, indifferent, operational, alive. She had inherited an empire and dismantled a woman. She had corrected injustices and created new wounds. She had passed a test she never agreed to take. And in the stillness that followed, the question remained, not just for her, but for anyone watching closely. If mercy allows injustice to survive, and justice requires cruelty to function, which failure do we choose to live with? The empire endured. What Rowan would become, that remained unresolved. We hope you enjoyed this story. Please don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Get us to 1,000 followers.